Before I say yes, let everyone hear what the chemist in Owerri told me.
This woman is grieving. Ignore her. Continue the ceremony.
You bought the poison 3 days before my husband started vomiting blood. The chemist remembers your face. Shut your mouth. You will disgrace this family in front of everyone. Mama, please, be silent. The police are already outside this compound, Mama. I called them this morning.
Rebecca, you don't know what you are saying.
I know exactly what I am saying, Michael. You killed your own brother for this compound. Today you will answer for it at your own wedding.
3 months earlier, Rebecca had been a wife, not a widow. David had built their home in Enugu with his own hands, brick by brick, long before he could afford to hire workers to finish it. She remembered him whistling in the compound every morning, calling her name before the sun was fully up, teasing their children until they laughed too loud for the neighbors. Their marriage was not perfect, but it was hers. It was real. It was the only thing in her life that had never once felt borrowed. Then David fell sick. It started small, a stomach pain he laughed off, a tiredness he blamed on work. Within 10 days, he could not stand without help. Within 2 weeks, he was vomiting blood into a basin Rebecca held with shaking hands, begging him to let her take him to a real hospital in the city instead of the herbalist his mother insisted on calling. By the time they reached Enugu's General Hospital, David's body had already given up the fight his spirit was still trying to win. He died holding Rebecca's hand, whispering for her to protect their children, never once knowing what was already moving against her. The burial had not even settled in the soil before the family gathered in David's compound, not to mourn him, but to discuss what would happen to his wife. She must marry Michael, Mama Ngozi announced to the elders, her voice flat, as though she were discussing the weather and not her son's widow. The wealth of this family does not live with a woman. It stays inside. Rebecca stood at the edge of the room in her mourning cloth, her 2 children, Daniel and Faith, pressed against her, and she understood for the first time that grief was a luxury her family had already decided she could not afford. Michael, David's younger brother, said nothing. He only watched her with an expression Rebecca could not name then, but would never forget later. Something too calm for a man being handed his dead brother's wife and fortune in the same breath. "I will not marry him," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Then you will leave this compound with nothing. No house, no land, no school fees for your children. You think David's money belongs to you simply because you wore his ring?" Rebecca had no lawyer, no brother to fight for her, no money saved that the family did not already control. She agreed to the marriage the way a drowning woman agrees to hold on to anything floating nearby, not out of acceptance, but survival. The wedding was set for 6 weeks later, and the family moved quickly, as though afraid she might find a way to refuse again if given too much time to think. Those 6 weeks tested her in ways grief alone never had. Mama Ngozi moved into David's house within days of the funeral, rearranging furniture as though erasing the evidence of a marriage that had once existed there. Faith's small bed was pushed into a corner to make room for wedding cloth deliveries. Daniel, only 8 years old, asked Rebecca one night why his uncle now slept in his father's old chair, why the house no longer smelled like his father's aftershave instead of someone else's cologne instead. Rebecca had no answer that would not break either of their hearts further, so she simply held him until he fell asleep, counting the months until she would understand enough to act. Michael, for his part, played the role of grieving brother turned reluctant protector with unsettling skill. He brought provisions to the house, he spoke softly to the children, he told Rebecca more than once that he only agreed to this arrangement to keep her and the children safe, as though he was the one sacrificing something. Rebecca watched him say these words and felt something curdle inside her chest. Not grief this time, but suspicion sharpening itself into something close to certainty. It was during those first 6 weeks that the first crack appeared. Patience, Michael's younger sister, had always been kind to Rebecca in small, quiet ways. A warning glance here, a comforting hand there. One evening, after one cup of palm wine too much at a family gathering, Patience's tongue loosened in a way her sober self would never have allowed. Michael said David would not last past harvest, Patience muttered, staring into her cup, not realizing Rebecca was close enough to hear. He said it like he already knew what would happen. Knew, like it was already decided. Rebecca went cold from the inside out. What do you mean, decided? Patience's eyes widened as the wine cleared just enough for fear to return. Nothing! I said nothing. Forget I spoke. But Rebecca could not forget. That single sentence rearranged everything she thought she understood about her husband's death. She began watching Michael differently. The way he avoided her eyes at dinner. The way he had been the one to insist on the herbalist instead of the hospital. The way he had inherited everything so smoothly, so quickly, as though the path had been cleared long before David ever fell ill. She told no one what she suspected. She smiled at the wedding preparations. She allowed the tailor to fit her for the white wrapper. She let Mama Ngozi believe she had finally accepted her fate, because a woman who shows her hand too early loses the only advantage she has left. In secret, Rebecca began asking questions. She learned David had complained of a strange bitterness in his food in his final week, something he mentioned once in passing to a neighbor and never again. She traveled quietly to Owerri, where a cousin worked, and visited chemists near the area Michael frequently traveled to on business. At the third shop, an old chemist recognized the photograph of Michael immediately. "That man bought rat poison in a quantity too large for rats," he said, frowning at the memory. "I remember because he asked me strange questions. How long such a thing takes on a grown man, whether it could be hidden in pepper soup. I thought he was joking. I did not think a man could joke about such a thing and mean it." Rebecca recorded every word on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. Outside the chemist's shop, she sat in the back of a taxi for nearly an hour, unable to move, staring at the recording as though it might disappear if she looked away. She thought of David's hand in hers in those final hospital hours, the way he had apologized for leaving her, never once knowing the apology should have belonged to someone else entirely. Grief and rage rose in her together, and for the first time since the burial, she allowed herself to weep without restraint, the taxi driver glancing at her with quiet, uncomfortable sympathy. She gathered the chemist's statement, David's hospital records showing symptoms consistent with poisoning, and Patience's drunken confession, which she gently coaxed into a fuller, sober admission weeks later, appealing to whatever conscience the younger woman still had left. Patience, terrified but guilt-ridden, agreed to speak if it ever came to that. Rebecca contacted a police inspector in Enugu she had once helped years earlier, a man named Kenneth, who remembered her kindness and was willing to listen. In the days before the wedding, fear nearly swallowed her resolve. What if the chemist changed his story under pressure? What if Patience lost her courage at the last moment? What if Michael noticed the change in her eyes and disappeared before justice could reach him? Rebecca prayed alone in the small hours of those final nights, not for revenge, but for strength enough to finish what she had started, for her children's sake more than her own. By the time the wedding day arrived, Rebecca was no longer a woman being forced into a marriage. She was a woman walking deliberately into a trap she herself had built. The compound was full. Drummers, relatives in their finest clothes, the smell of jollof rice and roasted goat meat thick in the air, Mama Ngozi beaming as though she had personally orchestrated a triumph rather than a tragedy. Michael stood beside the local pastor, dressed in his finest traditional attire, smiling the easy smile of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. When the pastor asked if anyone present knew any reason this union should not proceed, Rebecca stepped forward instead of remaining silent as expected. "Before I say yes," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly still compound, "let everyone hear what the chemist in Owerri told me." The laughter Michael offered first did not last. As Rebecca read aloud from her notes, the dates, the chemist's words, Patience's confession now read in full before her own brother's stunned face, the celebration around them collapsed into stunned silence and then chaos. Mama Ngozi grabbed Rebecca's wrist, hissing for her to be silent, but Rebecca had already done what silence could no longer undo. "The police are already outside this compound, Mama," I said. "I called them this morning." Inspector Kenneth walked through the gate exactly as she finished speaking, 2 officers behind him, drawn by both Rebecca's earlier report and the noise now spilling from the compound walls. Michael tried to run towards the back fence and was caught before he reached it, his fine wedding attire torn in the struggle. Mama Ngozi screamed that it was all a lie, a conspiracy, a widow's madness, until Patience, weeping, stepped forward in front of the entire gathering and confirmed every word her brother had once let slip to her in confidence.
The wedding the family had forced into existence became instead the very scene of their undoing. Michael was arrested for the murder of his own brother. Mama Ngozi was investigated for her role in pressuring the herbalist away from proper medical care and for the cruelty of forcing a grieving widow into marriage with the man who killed her husband. The story spread through Enugu within days, not as gossip, but as a warning whispered in every market and church about what happens when greed forgets that the dead sometimes leave witnesses behind. Rebecca did not disappear quietly into the background of her own victory. She stood in the compound days later, the same compound that had once tried to strip her of everything and reclaimed it formally. David's land, his business, his name fully cleared of the cowardice the family had tried to bury alongside him. Daniel and Faith grew up not with the story of a mother who survived tragedy, but of a mother who refused to let injustice finish what poison had started. Mama Ngozi, stripped of the wealth and standing she once commanded so easily, was left to face a community that no longer bowed to her name. Michael faced trial and faced it alone, the family who once called him their hope for the future, now too ashamed to sit beside him in court. Patience, though spared prosecution for her honesty, carried the weight of her silence for the rest of her days, a debt she repaid slowly by standing beside Rebecca whenever the courts required it. And Rebecca, widow, accused madwoman, reluctant bride, became instead the woman an entire town remembered for one simple, unshakable truth. Some women bend only long enough to find the exact place where their enemies are weakest. Tell us in the comments, if you were Rebecca, would you have exposed everything at the women itself or waited until after to strike? If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.